All right. It's 1:14, but might as well get started. Because there's a lot to talk about, as you can see from the template. But this is a framework lecture. It's going to deal with a lot of kind of the tail end of what von Trezes said in the critique lecture and kind of answering what some of the stuff that was said in the critique lecture. And so this is coming from a perspective of what the game of debate has to say about things like critiques, as well as like critiques on the affirmative. So just like a quick like table of contents, we're going to talk about like the history of framework. We're going to go through a framework debate versus a non-plan affirmative. We're going to look at the AF arguments, the neg arguments. We're going to look at 2AC framing to the critique, and then we're going to talk about impact framing. So we're going to talk about what we do, how we weigh impacts, and versus like and we're going to have an example of the public health advantage from the fracking affirmative versus the infrastructure disad, which is climate change causes extinction. So with that, where did framework start? Well, it was created in 2003 by a Dartmouth coach that was a response to the Louisville Project. Now, the Louisville Project was a team of Black debaters who wanted to change the game of debate and really push towards talking about communities of color and who are affected by things like, violence of the state, et cetera, et cetera. They first started on a topic that um, pulled the US out of NATO. And so they said that we should leave the game of debate and NATO. And so it was pushing towards like the white dominant narrative of debate, et cetera. And this all started what was called the clash of civilizations. And so it's this idea of kind of the critical form of debate versus more of the policy oriented form of debate. And this kind of has happened for the past 20 years. And framework was developed in response to that. Although at the start, it was very much like considered a bad argument, or not a bad argument, but it was considered kind of, cliche almost. It's like you whine about fairness, etc. But it has been innovated over the years to be much more effective in debate and, not as like harmful as people would say. The two big kind of teams at the time that were in the clash was Whitman. Whitman really went to this author called Boggs, and he had a few arguments about why discussing kind of the intricacies of policy and discussing and debating about these things were good and how they were innovative and etc. Fort Hayes, on the other hand, was the real big critique team. They were the ones who developed the ideas of the critique early in its invention. And so like, for example, there was kind of a time where they would make permutations but not call them permutations. So it would be a real kind of like hard time for the judges, but it's like, oh yeah, that's a perm, but it's not really a permutation. And so there's a few debates actually still online where you can see Whitman and Fort Hayes debate. I remember watching the 2004 CETA finals, and it's Whitman versus Fort Hayes, and it was a really good debate for its time. And so this was kind of the spawn of framework and the kind of spawn of the clash of civilizations. Okay, so oops, I forgot to put an animation on this. So what is framework? Framework is a question of what we do in this space. And so it both exists on the affirmative and on the negative. Earlier in the week, y'all learned about topicality. Topicality can be very similar to framework slash TUSFG. And so both go hand in hand really. But topicality is a starting point. It answers the question of what do the words in the resolution mean? Whereas framework, on the other hand, begs the question of what do we do at that starting point? So it questions what kind of debate, what should debate look like? What kind of debate should be done in debate? A question of models. I want you all to pick up on the question of models of debate, because that's really what we're referring to. We have different visions of what debate should look like. And so there are other things like impact framework. It's what impact needs to be prioritized to determine, what we're able to weigh and whatnot. So later we'll talk about the public health advantage on the fracking AF versus the infrastructure disadvantage. And we'll talk about the ideas of utilitarianism versus deontology or structural violence. And so with this last kind of bullet point I got from one of my old lab leaders, Lincoln Garrett. He said, without framework arguments, debate is just a nebulous statements made without implications, without any tangential connections to wins or losses. And so that kind of has stuck with me. It's like, you always need to, no matter, even if you're not in a like framework debate, TUSFG debate, you need to be thinking about how you frame your arguments into that you can develop and ultimately like sound persuasive to the judge. So like, even like, let's say you're about to give a 2NR. It's like, okay, the 2NR, I have to do framing somewhere. And so the best type of framing is just like judge instruction. It's like, we've won this, and this argument, which means you can vote negative. And so it's like, even without like a TUSFG debate, framework and framing is one of the most important skills in debate. Okay, we're going to go through what TUSFG versus a non-plan affirmative would be. So like at the end of Von Trez's lecture, we talked about how you could read critiques on the affirmative. It's a very kind of what y'all won't do in JV and what you'll do in like low-level varsity, but eventually you'll get there. And framework or TUSFG is one of the ways you answer these non-plan affirmatives. So they usually deal with something critical, some harm in the status quo that, you know, is more kind of philosophically dense than that the state could not resolve, or that the state would just kind of create some type of bad alternative to. And so when you don't have an idea of what to answer those type of affirmatives, you resort to things like framework or TUSFG. Same difference, they're interchangeable words, I think. So this is an example of what TUSFG is, kind of the interpretation standards level. Think of it as just the normal topicality argument. So you got your interpretation. So I took our interpretation from last year's college topic. So last year's college topic was about limiting defense pacts and reducing alliance commitments. And so we're like, our interpretation is that the AF should defend a hypothetical implementation of a plan done by the United States federal government. In your case, it would say increases water protection on water resources in the United States. And so then we read this piece of Erickson evidence that talks about, that defines what the United States federal government is, and it defines the phrase United States federal government should. And it says that, you know, it means that it's a government action, that there's legislation involved, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's at the top, you got your interpretation. Then you have your violation. Why, you know, the affirmative doesn't implement a hypothetical implementation of a plan. They're just kind of on, and they advocate for some type of, you know, strategy that, you know, is not a federal government action. And lastly, you have your standards debate. So, well, I'm going to talk more about more specific standards, but this is kind of the basis, or this is the standards that we read, but there is tons more, and I'm gonna talk about like just the common ones that you'll see. So we read ground loss and in-round abuse. We lose all critique and disad ground that are specific to the topic, moots pre-tournament prep. And so our argument is just like, the affirmative has made it so we don't have predictable negative ground. We have nothing to say because the AF has said we will not use the USFG, because the USFG is the only stasis point in that we have come to agree on. The second argument we went for is truth testing. Truth testing is this idea that if we do not test the affirmative, we do not know the truthiness of it. So all of debate is really about well-prepared opponents, right? So there's an affirmative and a negative. Y'all know this. The negative should be prepared in what the affirmative has to say, or, you know, to some degree, right? And the resolution is our stasis point. We both agreed that come to debate on the resolution. And so if the affirmative moves the stasis point to somewhere else, it becomes unfair for the negative. And if we can't test what the affirmative has said, how do we know if it's a good idea or not? And so that's the idea of truth testing. The last argument that we read was clash. Clash is this idea that the resolution, like stasis point is the resolution is the only stasis point, and only to have kind of a nuanced debate about, anything, there has to be a point of engagement. And the resolution is that point of engagement. And without kind of that point of engagement, debate falls into what I'll talk about as echo chambers and monologues, where we just talk past each other and the affirmative lectures the negative on the AF, but there's no real kind of clash between the two. Okay, these are common standards that I talked about a little bit, but these are more of them. So the first is limits. Limits on the resolution is a good idea. There's a defined there's a resolution, and we have to define it and limit out certain things. I.e., you would limit out an affirmative that deals with like topicality would question whether or not we should have affirmatives that deal with the ocean. With framework to USFG, it's like, do we limit out affirmatives that would build like mutual aid funds, or that would build things like that? Ground is a question of what the negative has to say. So it's like, we could have said, we have these arguments prepped, but none of these arguments link to what the affirmative has said, right? Is because the affirmative has skewed the question of, the resolution. And so now all of these things that we prepped have gone out the window. Truth testing, I already talked about. Procedural fairness, it's just a question of fairness. It's, does the AF make the debate unfair? Does, do they shift the goalposts on what it means to be affirmative? Do they make it so that, all of our ground, that we lose all of our ground, et cetera, et cetera? And fairness as an impact is very common in these debates. Competitive equity. So each side has a defined space within the debate. There are limits on the affirmative, whereas the negative doesn't have as many limits because the AF gets to pick and choose what they want to debate about, right? So kind of having unlimited things on what the negative could do is the kind of space of debate. But if the affirmative kind of skews the resolutional question, then it becomes very hard to be negative. So we have to kind of equally define the affirmative and negative ground, because that's what creates good engagement, clash, and good debates. Last kind of common framework standard that I've seen a lot is advocacy skills. So this goes along, I might have put more standards on the next slide. So advocacy skills are really about, we come to debate to kind of learn, and kind of debate has educational benefits. And so if we have debates on like the intricacies of policy, we really kind of gear towards leaving debate and doing, something with those skills. And so we have to, so kind of debating about certain topical plan actions, debating about, the resolution kind of allows us to build those skills in debate, so that eventually we can go out and advocate for, like anti-fracking bills, or we can advocate for like the need for clean water, the need to address, chemicals in water, the need to address climate change, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's kind of only with like building skills of talking about policy can we really do that. Oh yeah, I did put other ones. Whoops. Okay. Role playing good, kind of the same way. We role play as a state. We're both kind of each AF neg team is kind of both trying to get bills past Congress. It's kind of, this one's kind of an outdated standard, because it's like, we're not really actually Congress. It's just like, if you think the affirmative is a good idea. The next is topic education. I think topic education is kind of underdeveloped, and I think on topics that really kind of deal with the personal side, or like that affects all of us. So for example, last year, criminal justice, topic education was probably one of the things that was like best needed, because like law enforcement is always around, and like there's always kind of living within law. Or even like for example, when my freshman year of college, we debated the United States federal government should implement a national health insurance. And so kind of if we debate about national health insurance, it builds health education, and we can move towards kind of bettering, everyone's health, et cetera. And I think water is in the same particular space that I think healthcare was. So if we can have topic education, it means that we debate about the questions around water and what clean water looks like and how we can provide the best means of having clean water. Okay, next is clash. I kind of already talked a little bit about clash, but it's like there are neg, af grounds. Point of engagement is the resolution. Clash happens when both agree upon that point of engagement. The last thing is stasis point. The resolution is the only agreed upon stasis point before the debate, which I think is kind of the really important argument that I want y'all to kind of come away with this, is that we only have as being negative, you only have the resolution because you do not know what the AF is going to say. So you can only prepare for arguments around the resolution. It's like, okay, well, these are the most common AFs. So I'm going to identify my neg research burden against these affirmatives. And so when the AF kind of moots that stasis point, it becomes very hard to be negative. And so I kind of want y'all to think about the model of debate that some of these arguments would set up. So if it's stasis, it's like resolutional point of clash. That's the model of debate you're thinking about. So framework debates are all about models. So your envision for how debate should look like. Okay, these are arguments that in the block, what teams reading TUSFG/framework will say. Debate is a game. Debate has educational benefits, but it's first and foremost a competitive game. There are winners and losers in debate. We come here to win trophies. It's not an academic conference. Classic argument, people will make this all the time to skirt around the question of does education come first or does fairness come first? Well, framework teams, TUSFG teams are going to say that fairness should come first because debate is first and foremost a game and we should keep it fair. The next argument is debate is a game of inches, not miles. That means it can be won and lost in the margins. So any kind of tilt away to the other side gives a distinct and huge advantage. So if the affirmative is able to skew the kind of stasis point of the debate, then it allows them to have a much more larger advantage than the negative. The next is switch side debate. These arguments deal with the fact that whatever the affirmative has said, they could just say it on the negative. So it's like, if the affirmative, let's take the environmental justice critique, for example. If the affirmative was about how, the discourse around water policy is violent and it leads to the impacts of racial capitalism and, et cetera, et cetera. And then they have an alternative to resolve it. If the 1NC was TUSFG, then the block, you would make an argument that's like, hey, all of these arguments that you say on the affirmative, you can just say on the negative because we read these same arguments on the negative. And that way you can have a policy affirmative that, i.e. the fracking affirmative versus environmental justice critique. And then we have a debate about that. And so it would resolve a lot of and the reason why you say this is it would resolve a lot of the arguments that the affirmative is making. The affirmative is going to make arguments like, oh, you limit us out of debates. Oh, your interpretation is bad for debate because it means that, we can't read our arguments here. It's like, no, that's not what we're saying. We say you can still read your arguments, but you just have to read it. You have to read them on the negative. The next argument is topical version of the affirmative, the TVA, not the time variance authority. I'm sorry, but it kind of works like the time variance authority because, yeah, it acts different. So the TVA is an argument that says there is a topical version of what the affirmative has said. So if the affirmative is in the environmental justice critique, there's an affirmative that has a plan that could, be similar. So for example, if we take the environmental justice critique, we could say, hey, and they read that on the affirmative, we could say, hey, there is a topical version of your affirmative, and it's called declaring water a human right, or what's known as the public trust doctrine. And so the public trust doctrine says like, water is declared as a human right, there's no privatization of water, etc. And so that resolves a lot of your arguments here. And so it doesn't necessarily need to resolve all of the affirmative, but it just needs to be kind of in the ballpark of being able to be debated. So I think when you know that there's kind of an affirmative that is, if you know that you're going to debate a critical affirmative, you should think of a topical version of the AF before the round. It doesn't have to solve the AF, but it just has to be in kind of in the right direction. And so this allows you to be in debate. Now, what the affirmative is going to say to it is like, well, it doesn't necessarily solve the affirmative, right? It doesn't have this key thing of the affirmative. That's completely fine. Like, that's their argument. But what you say in response to that is I think is one of probably a very good argument. You say that those solvency deficits that you've just made, those arguments that you've made why the topical version of the AF does not resolve the original 1A affirmative are arguments you could have said on the negative to the top, or arguments we could have said on the negative to the topical version of the affirmative. And so I think that is a kind of a strong argument that, a lot of affirmatives can't really deal with. This is not necessarily true, or you don't necessarily have to have a piece of evidence along with your topical version of the AF, but it's always good to have one, because it's always like, look, here's a piece of solvency evidence that the affirmative could have read in this debate. And then the topical version of the AF proves that under your interpretation or your model of debate, there is ground for the affirmative to say what they've said, but say it with a topical plan action. And so that allows for clear debate. It resolves a lot of the impacts of fairness, ground, limits, etc. Okay. I talked about this a little bit in the beginning, but monologues versus dialogues. The skewing the stasis point allows the AF to produce an echo chamber where they lecture the negative about the AF, and there's no kind of clash between the two sides. And so I think this is kind of an important argument I haven't really heard in a long time, but I always thought it was persuasive, to me at least, that, how can, there be a debate when the negative is not well prepped, and etc. And I think this goes hand in hand with the next sort of argument, which is role of the negative. It's not necessarily an argument people make per se. I've seen it a few times, but it's really kind of a cross-ex question. So when you're debating a critical affirmative, one of the first questions I think you should always ask is, what is the role of the negative? Under your model debate, what does the negative do? Right? Because I think that's one of the most important questions to ask. And if they don't give you one, it proves all of your arguments about, why they skew fairness, why they don't have a stasis point, why the negative has no ground to say anything. Because debate is a two-sided game. There are two teams in debate. When one team is just like talking past the other one, it destroys the educational potential of debate. And so always ask what the role of the negative when the affirmative does not have a plan text. And I think this argument, I just love asking this question because a lot of people just fumble their answers. And so please ask it. It's just and then in the block, when you're making arguments, you can be like, 1AC cross-X proves that they have no role of the negative and means that all of our arguments are proven true because, they can't envision a model of debate where we have a side to negate on, etc. Okay. What is really TUSFG framework trying to achieve? Well, it's trying to set a predictable limit. It's trying to establish a model through which we can debate. Right? So generics are not good enough for clash. So the infrastructure disad, although a great argument, makes a ton of sense, is not necessarily your best argument when debating. You want to have core topic disadvantages. You want to be debating like, that's not necessarily like an econ disadvantage, but you want to maybe debate the oil disadvantage, why fracking kills the oil industry, right? Those are much more kind of better disadvantages than kind of your generic politics disadvantages. One side getting a monopoly on prep does not generate clash. And so I think this is true because if the affirmative skews the stasis point of the resolution, they then have a monopoly on prep because they only need to prep their certain arguments that they only think they'll hear, which is much more predictable than kind of the litany of arguments the negative could say against an affirmative that deals with the resolutional question. They craft their arguments the same way, and there's no clash over time. So this argument is really deals with like, if the affirmative skews the resolution question, they're going to hear framework almost every debate. I know this because we read a planless affirmative, and probably 85, 75% of our debates were against framework. And so um, so although they're like no clash, we built our affirmative to have some sort of clash and a role for the negative. And so I think a lot of times teams really don't have those things. Affirmatives don't have, a role of the negative, or don't have a model through which clash functions. And that's when framework is like probably most true. And so I think having those things are good. And so framework really tries to achieve a point through which clash can be facilitated. Okay, common 2AC arguments to TUSFG framework. Limits bad, limits on the topic, or the affirmative kills the type of education, limits debates like radical potential. The negative, the affirmative would say like, the negative's interpretation means we can't read these types of arguments, and they'll have examples of what they can't read. And then it's like they'll say limiting out these arguments is bad for debate because, we can't have the educational benefits that could come along with these things, or the organizing, like we can't, organize and create bonds of community building, etc. Next is creativity good. We should try to be creative around the topic. We should try to build kind of the same kind of arguments that they would say why limits are bad. They would say the alternative to that is creativity. Switch side debate. We shouldn't switch sides. It puts a limit on what things we can read in this space. And so like limiting out certain arguments on one side limits like how often you can read them, and makes it so that your kind of literature or your kind of position in debate is always kind of boxed into one side. And that's just kind of bad. The affirmative is a prerequisite. So usually the affirmative will make arguments to why like policy making is much better after, what their strategy is, or that they make it so that engagement, the political, comes more ethical, or et cetera, et cetera. And so usually teams will be like, we can resolve the impacts of like we can resolve like fairness and ground, but or they'll say, yeah, affirmative is a prerequisite so to like resolve X harm in the status quo, to create, better movements from environmental justice, etc. Next argument is framework is racist. Probably pretty persuasive, because it was created in response to a bunch of Black debaters who were trying to push towards creating community and creating a push towards a dominant white narrative within debate. The next argument is we do implement a hypothetical implementation of a plan. You could redefine what the USFG is. So for example, we read a piece of evidence that was like the USFG is the people. And so, we are doing the affirmative. So we are the USFG. And so I thought it was always a creative argument. A counter interpretation, which I think is one of, if not the best argument to make on a like procedural level. And so you have a different vision or a different model of what debate should look like. It could be like, only these arguments can be read, and it creates better debates, and, creates better community building, etc. The last thing is reasonability. And like in a T debate, I know my lab, we talked about reasonability a little after the topicality lecture. If the negative gets ground and it's good enough, then you should assume that the affirmative is topical. So if the negative could have said, for example, what we used to do is when we were debating framework, we would go to the team's wiki, their like what arguments they've read in the past, and we would say, okay, could they read this argument, this argument, this argument, this argument? And then we said they could have read all these arguments here. And then I would get up in the 1AR and I would say, look, here is what the arguments they've read in the past. They could have said all these arguments against our affirmative, but they chose not to. So don't punish us for them doing lazy debating. And so we're like, reasonably, that means we're topical. Okay, we're going to talk now that we shifted kind of, that's how, debates on TUSFG, against a planless affirmative, we're going to talk about debates that you potentially will be having Saturday, etc. So we're going to talk about what a 2AC kind of framing argument is against the critique. So this example that I pulled is the example from the demo debate. I don't know how many of you watched it, but this is, etc. So like, for TUSFG, you have your interpretation. Weigh the implementation of the plan. Any alternative must defend uniqueness and material solvency. So you have your interpretation, you have your standards. First is fairness, moves 8 minutes of the 1AC in favor of academic vacuum, kills clash, it eliminates incentives for nuanced research. Vote affirmative even if we lose framework because because we're impacting the alternative and they have to beat the case to win. And then we just defended our epistemology. I know Von Tres talked about epistemology a little bit in the critique lecture. So of course it's a question of what we know and we come to understand. So we said, environmentalism is a good idea and it's a good kind of epistemology to think from. And so these are the kind of framework arguments that you make on a 2AC to the critique. Now there's different arguments you could make. Like for example, I think one of a good argument to probably make is something that involves more of the public health advantage, just because I think it's much more geared towards answering the environmental justice critique. So it could read something along the lines of like, vote affirmative because our representations are in the same direction as theirs, but we have a material solvency to, resolve the impacts of dirty water or, something along the lines of that. And I think that kind of pushes the envelope to get more towards the critique, because this is right now is when Liam and I wrote it, very generic. But the main argument that the affirmative wants to go for in these debates is that the debate needs to focus around the plan. And if it doesn't focus around the plan, it creates unfairness and it destroys clash. And the reason why it does that is because the negative could just get up in the debate and say, you link to this critique, you lose, right? And so if you watch the demo debate in the 1AR, this is the argument I'm making. I say, they create a you link, you lose, which is a bad form of debate because it doesn't directly talk about the actions of the plan, right? And so if they can get up and just say, actions, if they can say the action of the plan doesn't matter, it's just a question of like which research is better, right? That kind of destroys what the whole debate was about, because the affirmative chooses what the debate is about. And so if the affirmative says, we want to talk about fracking, and the negative can just say, you know what, nah, we're not going to talk about fracking. We're just going to say why your representations of environmentalism are bad. And it's like, well, that kind of destroys all of debate. It means that the negative is always a speech ahead of the affirmative. And so in order to like get back, the affirmative needs to say, you need to weigh the implementation of the plan, right? And you need to kind of the link of the critique needs to be specific to the action of the plan. Otherwise it kills fairness, etc. Because at the end of the day, the affirmative really just wants to do with framing arguments is weigh the affirmative, weigh the impacts of the affirmative versus the critique, right? So this is why in like the demo debate, I was like, you need to weigh the impacts of the affirmative because we can resolve a material harm, whereas the alternative cannot resolve a material harm. We have a model of action that can change the status quo of fracking and move towards clean water and resolve biodiversity, right? And so these are the arguments I think that you kind of want to gear towards in like the 1AR, etc. And so if you can just really framework 2AC to the K is just, you want to weigh the affirmative, because if you don't, the negative can get away with just being like, this debate is a question about scholarship, nothing else matters, none of their impacts matter in this debate, right? And the biggest way that the affirmatives win this debate, win versus the critique, is saying, no, we need to have debates around the plan, and they need to be discussing like the implementation of it. And so with that, we need to weigh the impacts of it. Okay, next is impact framing, the kind of how we evaluate impacts and how we think about how impacts work. So I pose this question to y'all. How do we evaluate the impact of the public health advantage on the fracking affirmative versus extinction that would happen from the infrastructure disadd? So this is kind of a rhetorical question, but just like the way we do it, I guess it's not rhetorical because I have an answer, but the way we do it is impact framing. And so impact framing is very important. Unfortunately, I don't think there's a piece of evidence in the file that is like, you should prioritize X impact over this one. But you can always just make these arguments, I think, in like the 2AC, right? So if the affirmative or the negative gets up and reads the infrastructure disadvantage, you can be like, you know what? No, you should not prioritize the impacts of extinction. You should prioritize our arguments of structural violence because they're harming communities first. And so that brings us to utilitarianism versus structural violence. So the John Stuart Mill, who is kind of the father, it's going to come back. The father of utilitarianism, wow, it didn't come back. He writes, man, I thought this credit would be good. He writes, actions are right in the production as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. Okay, I'm just going to let it scroll. But generally what that means, and the second line of that, which is the phrase I think all of you should always remember when debating utilitarianism, is the greatest good for the greatest number. Now, although it's not really what John Stuart Mill is saying when he first writes utilitarianism, or when he first theorizes about it in like the 1870s, I think. And so he's really writing about like happiness. He thinks that what really matters in this world is how do we create the most happiness for the most people. And so debate has kind of taken that argument and has made it to just the one-liner phrase of, greatest good for the greatest amount. Now, it's very unfortunate because John Stuart Mill is kind of writing some good arguments in like the 1800s about this, but it's unfortunate that it's only to this one phrase sentence. And so utilitarianism, again, is just this idea that we should create happiness. And so with the infrastructure disadvantage, it's like extinction is coming, and if extinction happens, everyone's unhappy because everyone's dead. And so we need to prioritize the greatest number for the greatest amount. Otherwise, it causes, otherwise extinction happens and we all die, right? But that's a question of like, obviously there's many questions before that, but that's generally how the impact is like argued. Now, on the other hand, structural violence. So we have the impact to the public health impact, that communities of color are most harmed by fracking as there is chemicals in the water. So it deals with everyday impacts that are much smaller in magnitude, but are higher in probability and time frame. So think back to the disadvantage lecture. Magnitude is like how big the impact is. Obviously, extinction caused by climate change is bigger than structural violence. But where structural violence has the climate change beat is on the question of probability and time frame, because we know that structural violence is happening to those who have unsafe drinking water, and we know that the time frame is now. So with the classic argument that you can make with the public health advantage is that utilitarianism, the framing of util, glosses over the violence that happens in our everyday lives, right? So it's like you constantly focus on this extinction scenario, but misdiagnose the real structures and the real problems that are happening, like people not having clean water. And so this is why I've kind of made a little bullet point list of like how the debate would happen and like what are the thesis of the arguments. So it's like public health advantage is that the water is dirty and is killing people. Fracking is the reason why that's happening. And so the affirmative would say you should prefer structural violence over low probability impacts. So the idea is like, would the infrastructure bill really cause extinction? Like probability, like speaking on a question of probability, like is the infrastructure bill really going to solve climate change? And so you have to think about those questions, like how probable is that going to be true? And so that's what you have to think about in these impact debates. Like, you know that structural violence is happening, and you know that you may not have the biggest magnitude, but you know that it's happening. So you can always say time frame and probability outweigh magnitude, because if you win 2, it's better than just winning 1, right? And that's a reason to prefer it. On the other side, on the infrastructure disadvantage, without the bill, extinction happens because we can't resolve climate change. The EAF causes the bill not to pass, and you should prefer magnitude over probability. And the reason someone would say this is like, you can't have, there's a classic phrase that everyone kind of has said at least once in their debate careers is, there is no value to life without life itself. And so kind of life is a prerequisite to all those things. So if extinction happens, we have no life to value. And so it's kind of a question of like, well, yeah, in that sense, we should prioritize extinction, because extinction of all else kills everyone. It's indiscriminate. And so have to prioritize that, right? And so this is the debate that happens. And so this is kind of like where really impact debates go down. And these are really good debates, although sometimes tough to decide. They can be really good or they can be really bad. And so it gets to the kind of philosophical question of these things. But yeah, y'all got any questions?